Commanders involved in this historical event. These are all commanders who appeared throughout this operation. Bullet Operator Major General John B. Wogan, Commanding General, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Dale E. Means, Assistant Chief of Staff, 13th Armored Division, until April 19th. Bullet Operator Colonel William H. Wood, Assistant Chief of Staff, 13th Armored Division, from April 19th. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, Commanding Officer, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Captain O'Malley, Task Force Commander, C Company, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Colonel Carlton H. Russell, Combat Command A Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Colonel Harris M. Molaski, Combat Command B Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator General Matthew Ridgway, former Commander, 18 Airborne Corps, previous assignment. Bullet Operator General George S. Patton, Jr., Commanding General, U.S. 3rd Army Destination Command. Time, 0615 hours. Date, April 19th, 1945. Location, Mulheim in der Ruhr, Germany. Assembly area following completion of Ruhr Pocket operations. Weather, clear morning. Temperature warming to approximately 12 degrees Celsius, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Dry roads for the first time in weeks. Units involved: 13th Armored Division, U.S., 24th Tank Battalion, 46th Tank Battalion, 45th Tank Battalion, 67th Armored Infantry Battalion, 496th, 497th, 498th Armored Field Artillery Battalions, 124th Armored Engineer Battalion, 93rd Cavalry. Reconnaissance Squadron. Administrative movement from Ruhr region to Nunkirchen Assembly area. The column of tanks and trucks stretched for miles along the road leading south from Mulheim and der Ruhr on the morning of April 19, 1945, their engines rumbling in a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of the war's final weeks. Pete Stipanovich from Company B of the 24th Tank Battalion sat in the driver's position of his Sherman tank, watching the endless procession of vehicles ahead disappear around curves and over hills, and try to remember what peace felt like. 8 days earlier, the division had been fighting house to house through Duisburg and Mettmann, completing the reduction of the Ruhr pocket that had trapped over 300,000 German soldiers. Now they were moving again, destination unknown to most soldiers, though rumors circulated constantly. Some said they were heading south to Bavaria. Others claimed Austria. A few insisted they be sent to Pacific once Germany surrendered. Stipanovich didn't particularly care where they were going as long as it involved less shooting than the past 3 weeks had. His tank commander, a sergeant whose name Stipanovich always remembered as simply Sarge, stood in the turret scanning the countryside and occasionally consulting the map that was supposed to guide them to wherever they were supposed to be going. Major General John B. Wogan stood outside his command vehicle in Mulheim at first light, watching Combat Command B under Colonel Harris Molaski begin their portion of the 250-mile march that would reposition the entire 13th Armored Division from Ruhr Industrial Region to assembly areas near Nunkirchen in central Germany. The movement order had come down from 18 Airborne Corps headquarters the previous evening. The division was being transferred from Corps Control back to 3rd Army under General George S. Patton, required at Nunkirchen by April 22nd for new operational tasking that would drive them into Bavaria and eventually Austria. 250 miles in 4 days was an impossible timeline, but was aggressive for a division that had just spent 8 days in sustained combat operations and needed maintenance, resupply, and rest more than it needed another forced march. Wogan turned to Colonel William H. Wood, who had just assumed duties as Assistant Chief of Staff on April 19th. Replacing Lieutenant Colonel Dale E. Means in a routine personnel rotation. The men are exhausted, the vehicles need work, and we're asking them to cover 60 miles a day through Germany while the war is still technically ongoing. What's your assessment? Would consider before answering. Sir, they're tired, but they'll do it. They always do. We'll lose some vehicles to mechanical failures. Some soldiers will need medical attention for exhaustion, but we'll be at Nunkirchen by the 22nd. The march south from Mulheim proceeded through countryside that showed every sign of Germany's complete collapse. Destroyed cities visible in the distance, columns of refugees trudging along roads, with whatever possessions they could carry. Abandoned military equipment scattered in ditches where retreating German forces had discarded it when fuel ran out or mechanical failures occurred. At 0847 hours, Stepanovich's column passed through a small town whose name he never learned, where German civilians stood watching American armor roll past with expressions that had become familiar over recent weeks. A mixture of fear, relief, and exhausted acceptance that their world had ended and something new was beginning. An elderly German woman stood in front of a damaged house, holding a framed photograph. Stepanovich assumed it was a son or husband who wouldn't be coming home, and made eye contact with him as his tank passed. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge the shared humanity underneath the uniforms and national identities. But the moment passed before words formed and his tank was already moving beyond her, leaving her standing alone with her photograph and her grief. By midday on April 19th, the division had covered approximately 40 kilometers and was approaching the first scheduled halt, where units would pause briefly for refueling, maintenance checks, and to allow stragglers to catch up with their parent formations. Captain O'Malley, commanding his task force from a 46 Tank Battalion, called a halt at 1,215 hours in a village that had surrendered without resistance when American forces appeared. His crews immediately began the routine that had become second nature during weeks of operations. Checking track tension, topping off fuel tanks from the supply trucks that had followed the column, conducting quick inspections for mechanical issues that needed immediate attention. But this halt included something different from the combat operations they had just completed: the opportunity to actually rest in buildings rather than sleeping beside vehicles or in muddy ditches. O'Malley watched the soldiers enter German houses that had been vacated by fleeing civilians or requisitioned by military government officers, saw them discover beds with actual mattresses and pillows, and understood that this would be the first time many had slept indoors in weeks. A tank driver from 2nd Platoon emerged from a house, looking almost confused. "Sir, there's a bed in there. An actual bed. And it's got clean sheets. Do we really get to sleep in it?" O'Malley suppressed a smile. "Yeah, soldier, we really do. Enjoy it while it lasts, because once we reach Nunkirchen, we're probably going right back to sleeping in the mud." The experience of sleeping in German beds during the march from Mulheim to Nunkirchen created a strange psychological effect on soldiers who had spent months living in the field, operating in conditions where basic comfort was a distant memory and anything beyond survival seemed like luxury. That first night, April 19th, when units halted in villages along the route, soldiers discovered what it meant to sleep on something softer than dirt or the hull of a tank. Pete Stepanovich, assigned to a room in a German farmhouse with 3 other crew members, later described the experience in terms that captured the surreal nature of the moment. "We walked into this house, and there were 4 beds with actual blankets. The family had left. I don't know if they ran away or were evacuated, but their stuff was still there. Pictures on the walls, clothes in closets, a tea kettle on the stove. It felt wrong somehow, like we were intruding on someone's life. But we were also so tired that we collapsed into those beds and slept for 6 hours straight, which was the most sleep we'd had in one stretch since crossing into Germany." The moral ambiguity of occupying enemy civilian spaces, using their possessions, sleeping in their homes while a war that had destroyed their country was still technically ongoing. These were questions that exhausted soldiers didn't have energy to fully process, but that would resurface in memories years later. The march resumed at dawn on April 20th after a night that had given soldiers their first real rest in weeks, though the psychological impact of sleeping in German beds while German families were displaced created an undertone of unease that persisted throughout the day's movement. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, commanding Task Force Delnor from a 46 Tank Battalion, received his movement orders at 0545 and began organizing his units for the day's march. The route would take them further south through central Germany, bypassing major cities that were still being reduced by other Allied forces, following secondary roads that were in better condition than the torn-up highways that had carried the bulk of military traffic. At 0734, as Delnor's column moved through agricultural country where spring planting had been abandoned when farm workers either fled or conscripted, they encountered a surreal scene: German civilians working in fields, tending crops as if the war wasn't ending around them, as if American tanks rolling past was simply another inconvenience in a year of inconveniences. A farmer, elderly and bent from decades of labor, looked up from his work as Delnor's command tank passed, made brief eye contact, and returned to hoeing his field. The disconnect between the war that soldiers were experiencing and the civilian life that was attempting to continue despite that war created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to process. The scavenging for fresh eggs during the march became both practical necessity and small morale boost for soldiers who had been living on C-rations and K-rations for so long that the idea of fresh food seemed almost decadent. Scott, a soldier from the 13th Armored whose accounts had documented other aspects of the division's operations, later described the egg foraging expeditions that occurred whenever the column halted in villages. "We've been eating rations out of cans for weeks. Beans, hash, mystery meat that all tasted like cardboard. When we stopped in these German villages and found chickens still laying eggs, it felt like discovering treasure. Guys would go through barns and coops collecting eggs. Then we'd cook them over improvised stoves or even over tank exhausts. Fresh eggs with bread we'd requisition from German bakeries. It sounds so simple now, but it felt like a feast. Made you remember there was life beyond combat rations and sleeping in mud." If you're learning about the small things that kept soldiers' morale up during the war's final weeks, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. We're documenting the human details that official history skip. The foraging also raised questions about the line between legitimate military requisition and looting, questions that different soldiers answered differently depending on their personal ethics and how hungry they were. By the evening of April 20th, the division had covered another 70 kilometers and was approaching the midpoint of the 250-mile march, with units halting in villages and small towns across a broad swath of central Germany. The administrative movement was proceeding smoothly by military standards. Vehicles were breaking down at expected rates rather than catastrophic ones. Soldiers were exhausted but functional, and the timeline to reach Nunkirchen by April 22nd seemed achievable. But the march was also revealing the accumulated wear on both equipment and personnel from weeks of continuous operations. Maintenance crews working through the night of April 20th to 21st documented mechanical failures that included throne tracks that required hours of field repair, engine problems that demanded parts they didn't have and had to improvise solutions for, transmission issues that would normally require vehicles to be pulled from service but that were fixed through temporary measures that would keep them running for a few more days. A maintenance sergeant, writing in a journal that will be preserved in division archives, noted, "We're holding this division together with wire prayers and spare parts cannibalized from vehicles we've abandoned. Every tank should be in a depot getting proper overhaul. Instead, we're patching them in the field and hoping they last until Germany surrenders." April 21st brought the division to Hanau, a city approximately 200 kilometers south of Moheim, where orders directed an 8-hour halt for what the movement plan euphemistically called rest, maintenance, and resupply, but what soldiers understood as a recognition that the division was approaching its operational limits and needed breathing room before the final push to Nunkirchen. The halt at Hanau allowed maintenance crews to conduct more extensive repairs than roadside stops permitted, gave supply officers time to redistribute ammunition and fuel to units that had consumed their loads unevenly, and most importantly, gave soldiers time to eat hot food, sleep for more than a few hours, and remember what it felt like to not be constantly moving. Pete Stipanovich, using the time to perform maintenance on his tank that had been deferred for days, discovered that the whistling noise the vehicle had been making for the past week was caused by a piece of shrapnel embedded in the engine deck that had been vibrating at a frequency that sounded eerily like a tea kettle. The discovery would become one of those small stories that soldiers shared years later, representative of the strange normalcy that developed during wartime where things that should have been concerning, like shrapnel embedded in your tank, became just another quirk to work around. The final leg of the march from Hanau to Nunkirchen on April 22nd proceeded with a sense of completion, soldiers understanding that they were approaching the end of this particular phase of operations and that whatever came next would be different from what had come before. Captain O'Malley, leading his task force along muddy roads that had been improved by engineer units preceding the main column, received radio transmission at 1,045 hours informing him that General George S. Patton would be addressing the division upon arrival at Nunkirchen, a piece of news that spread through the column with remarkable speed and created a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Patton's reputation preceded him, a commander known for demanding aggressive action, for having no patience with excuses, and for believing that audacity could accomplish what caution could not. The 13th Armored Division had performed well during the Ruhr Pocket operations, but, well, might not be sufficient for Patton, who measured success by different standards than most commanders. A tank commander from O'Malley's company voiced what many were thinking. Sir, if Patton's come and talked to us personally, it means he's got plans. Probably plans that involve us fighting through Bavaria or Austria or wherever the hell Germans are still holding out. We just finished one campaign, and we're about to start another. O'Malley nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly what it means. So enjoy the march while it lasts, because once we reach Nunkirchen, the easy part is over. The 13th Armored Division closed into assembly areas southeast of Bamberg on the afternoon of April 22nd, 1945, after completing the 250-mile march from Moheim in just under 4 days of continuous movement through the heart of Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, directing a battalion into designated positions near the small town of Eschenau, surveyed his vehicles and soldiers and calculated the toll the march had taken. They'd lost 9 tanks to mechanical failure serious enough to require leaving them behind for recovery units, had 3 more vehicles operating on borrowed time with repairs that were temporary at best, and had soldiers showing the kind of exhaustion that came not from a single hard day, but from sustained operations that never allowed complete recovery. At 1,434 hours, Delnor received updated orders from division headquarters. The entire division would move from Bamberg to Nunkirchen that evening, where they would receive operational briefings and meet General Patton the following morning. The order meant more movement when soldiers needed rest, but that was Third Army's operational philosophy. Maintain momentum, accept discomfort, prioritize mission over comfort. Delnor passed the orders to his company commanders with the addendum that had become routine. Get the men fed, check vehicles one more time, and prepare to move at 1,700 hours. I know everyone's tired. We move anyway. The move from Bamberg to Nunkirchen on the evening of April 22nd was mercifully short, approximately 30 kilometers over decent roads, but felt longer to soldiers who had been hoping for a night of rest after 4 days of marching. Pete Stipanovich, driving his Sherman to the gathering darkness, remembered the journey years later not for any dramatic incident, but for the crushing ordinariness of exhaustion. We'd been moving for 4 straight days, sleeping in snatches, eating when we could, and now when we thought we'd finally get a stop, we were moving again. Nobody complained out loud because complaining didn't change anything, but you could feel in the crew. Everyone was just done. Done moving, done driving, done with everything. But the tank kept moving because that's what tanks do, and we kept driving because that's what tank drivers do, and eventually we got to Nunkirchen and finally stopped. The arrival at Nunkirchen around 20-30 hours brought the division to assembly areas that would be their base for the next several days, while they prepared for operations that would take them into Bavaria and Austria as part of Third Army's final offensive. The morning of April 23rd brought the event that had been anticipated since news spread to the division the previous day. General George S. Patton's personal visit to address the 13th Armored Division and officially welcome them to Third Army. Soldiers who had been with the division since its activation understood that this represented a significant transition. They fought under 18 Airborne Corps during the Ruhr operations, had proven themselves in sustained combat, and were now being assigned to what many considered the most aggressive and successful army in the European theater. Captain O'Malley, ensuring his company was properly formed for Patton's inspection, walked among his tanks checking that crew members had clean uniforms as much as circumstances allowed, and that vehicles showed evidence of maintenance, even if that maintenance had been conducted under field conditions that left much to be desired. A young soldier, recently arrived as a replacement and experiencing his first major inspection, asked O'Malley nervously, "Sir, what's Patton like?" O'Malley considered how to answer honestly without either frightening the kid or sugarcoating reality. He's demanding. He expects aggressive action and doesn't have patience for excuses. But he's also effective. Third Army has advanced further and faster than anyone thought possible. If you do your job, support your crew, and show you're willing to fight, he'll respect that. If you make excuses or show hesitation, he'll eat you alive. Patton arrived at Nunkirchen at precisely 1,000 hours on April 23rd. His convoy of jeeps and command vehicles, moving with a speed and precision that characterized everything Third Army did. Soldiers who had assembled for the inspection stood at attention as Patton's vehicle stopped and the Third Army commander stepped out, wearing his distinctive helmet with 4 stars and the ivory-handled pistols that had become part of his public persona. Patton surveyed the assembled division with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, noting the condition of vehicles that showed evidence of hard use, the appearance of soldiers who were clean but showed the wear that weeks of combat created, the overall readiness posture of a division that had been fighting recently and would be fighting again soon. He walked directly to where Major General Wogan stood with his senior staff and extended his hand. "General Wogan, your division has been transferred to my command as of today. I've read the after-action reports from your Ruhr operations. Impressive work. You captured how many prisoners?" Wogan responded crisply. "Over 20,000, sir, during our portion of the Ruhr pocket reduction." Patton nodded with what might have been approval. "Good. You're going to get a chance to capture more. Third Army is driving into Bavaria and Austria, finishing what's left of German resistance before they can establish defensive positions in the mountains. Your division will be my spearhead. Questions?" Wogan had no questions because Patton's guidance was clear. Attack aggressively, maintain momentum, accept risk to achieve results. The inspection that followed Patton's arrival was characteristically thorough, with the Third Army commander walking among tanks and speaking directly to crews rather than limiting himself to conversations with officers. At one Sherman from the 24th Tank Battalion, Patton stopped and addressed Pete Stipanovich, who was standing beside his vehicle, trying not to show how nervous he felt being personally inspected by a 3-star general whose reputation made him seem larger than life. "You're the driver?" Patton asked. Stipanovich snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. Driver and assistant gunner, sir." Patton looked at the Sherman, noting the wear on the tracks, the makeshift repairs visible on the hull, the overall condition of a vehicle that had been used hard but maintained as well as field conditions permitted. "How many miles on this tank?" Stipanovich had to think before answering. "Unknown exactly, sir. We received it as a replacement in February after our original tank was knocked out. Since then, probably over 1,000 miles, maybe more." Patton's expression showed something that might have been respect. "And it's still running. That's good maintenance under difficult conditions. Keep it that way. You're going to need every mile this machine can give you over the next 2 weeks." He moved on to the next tank, leaving Stipanovich standing slightly straighter, feeling like he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. The address Patton gave to the assembled division that afternoon captured both his operational philosophy and his understanding of what motivated soldiers in the war's final weeks. Standing on the hood of a jeep so soldiers in the rear ranks could see him, Patton spoke in the high-pitched voice that always surprised people hearing it for first time, but that commanded attention through sheer force of personality rather than vocal quality. "Men of the 13th Armored Division, you've just finished fighting in the Ruhr pocket, where you helped capture over 300,000 German soldiers in what will be remembered as one of the great encirclement battles in military history. You performed well for a division with limited combat experience, and now you're part of Third Army, which means you're going to perform even better. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to drive to Bavaria, cross multiple rivers, smash whatever German resistance remains, and end this goddamn war in Europe. Some of you won't make it. That's the reality of war, and I won't lie to you about it. But the ones who do survive will go home knowing they were part of finishing what we started in Normandy. So stay alert, support each other, kill Germans before they kill you, and remember that speed is your protection. The faster we move, the less time the enemy has to prepare defenses that would cost us casualties. That's all. Dismissed." The days following Patton's address on April 23rd were consumed with preparations for the offensive that would begin on April 26th. 3 days of maintenance, resupply, tactical planning, and the administrative work that allowed divisions to transition from one operation to another. Captain O'Malley spent April 24th conducting maintenance on his task force's vehicles, replacing worn tracks, servicing engines, and addressing the 100 small mechanical issues that accumulated during sustained operations. His crews worked alongside battalion maintenance personnel, learning field expedient repairs that would keep tanks running when proper depot-level maintenance wasn't available. At 1,545 hours on April 24th, O'Malley gathered his tank commanders for a briefing on the upcoming offensive. We jump off on the 26th from Parsberg, driving south toward the Danube River. Patton wants us to cross the Danube, continue to the Isar River, force that crossing, and drive into Austria toward Braunau. The timeline is aggressive. He's talking about covering over 100 miles in less than a week while fighting through whatever German forces are between here and Austria. Expect river crossings under fire, expect German rear guards, and expect that we'll be moving faster than seems safe. That's how Third Army operates. A lieutenant from 2nd Platoon asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, how is this different from what we just did in the Ruhr?" O'Malley's answer was honest. In the Ruhr, we were trapping Germans who couldn't escape. In Bavaria, we're chasing Germans who are retreating. The fighting will be different, more movement, fewer set-piece battles, but potentially just as dangerous because we'll be operating at the end of long supply lines in terrain we haven't reconnoitered. The evening of April 25th brought the final night before the offensive began, and soldiers processed the impending return to combat in ways that reflected their individual personalities and coping mechanisms. Some wrote letters home, though mail service was uncertain, and many letters would arrive weeks after being written, if they arrived at all. Others cleaned weapons obsessively, finding comfort in the routine of disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly that had been drilled into them during training. A few gathered in small groups to talk about anything except the war, sports, girls, plans for after discharge, dreams about civilian life that seemed impossibly distant from their current reality. Pete Stipanovich, sitting beside his Sherman and working on a persistent, whistling noise that the tank made whenever the engine ran at certain RPMs, was joined by his tank commander, who sat down without speaking and shared a cigarette in the kind of comfortable silence that develops between people who've lived and worked together under stressful conditions. Finally, the tank commander spoke. "You know what I can't stop thinking about? That German woman we saw on April 19th, the one holding the photograph, standing in front of her destroyed house. I keep wondering who was in that picture. Son? Husband? And I wonder if she blames us for what happened to her country." Stipanovich had been thinking about the same woman. Probably. But what choice did we have? Germany started the war. Germany committed the atrocities. And Germany had to be stopped. That woman's tragedy is real, but it's also a consequence of choices her government made. They sat in silence after that, smoking and watching stars appear in the darkening sky, each carrying thoughts they couldn't fully articulate about guilt, responsibility, and the moral complexity of being soldiers in a war where the cause was just but the methods were brutal. The administrative nature of the 250-mile march from Mulheim to Nunkirchen, the fact that it was movement between operations rather than combat itself, created a psychological space for soldiers to process recent experiences and prepare mentally for what was coming next. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, reviewing his battalion's readiness on the night of April 25th, understood that the march had served purposes beyond simply repositioning the division geographically. It had given soldiers time to rest, even if that rest was interrupted by continued movement. It had allowed maintenance crews to address mechanical issues that would have been deferred during combat. It had provided psychological distance from the intensity of the Ruhr fighting, creating a buffer that helped soldiers transition from one operation to another without the mental accumulation of trauma that continuous combat created. But Delnor also understood that the respite was temporary and that the offensive beginning the next morning would test whether the division had recovered enough to execute Patton's demanding operational plans. At 2,200 hours, he walked through his battalion's positions one final time, checking on soldiers and vehicles, projecting confidence that he didn't entirely feel, performing the leadership rituals that commanders perform before sending men into combat. The night of April 25th to 26, 1945, was the last night of peace the 13th Armored Division would experience before plunging into the six-day offensive that would take them from Parsberg through Bavaria and into Austria. Soldiers tried to sleep, with varying success, knowing that exhaustion was cumulative and that whatever rest they got tonight would have to sustain them through days of continuous operations. Some succeeded in sleeping deeply, their bodies demanding rest and their minds shutting down to provide it. Others lay awake, staring at darkness and thinking about rivers they'd have to cross under fire, about German soldiers who would try to kill them, about the randomness of who survived combat and who didn't. Captain O'Malley, making a final check of his company's positions around midnight, found most of his soldiers asleep or trying to sleep, with only the necessary guards awake and alert. He stopped beside one Sherman where a young soldier was sitting with his back against the track, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep?" O'Malley asked quietly. The soldier shook his head. "No, sir. Keep thinking about tomorrow, about crossing rivers and fighting Germans and all the things that could go wrong." O'Malley sat down beside him. "That's normal. Every soldier thinks about that before combat. The fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart enough to recognize danger. What matters is whether you let that fear paralyze you or whether you use it to stay alert and keep yourself and your crew alive. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow comes whether we're ready or not, and being tired just makes everything harder." The soldier nodded, though whether he'd actually be able to sleep was questionable. O'Malley moved on, carrying his own fears and doubts, performing the leadership role that required projecting confidence regardless of internal uncertainty. The dawn of April 26, 1945, arrived with clear skies and temperatures that promised a warm spring day, conditions that would have been pleasant under any circumstances, except those requiring soldiers to begin a 6-day offensive that would test whether the 250-mile march from Mulheim to Nunkirchen had adequately prepared them for sustained combat operations. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor stood outside his command post at Parsberg at 0530 hours, watching his battalion conduct final preparations before the scheduled 0600 jump-off time, seeing crew members performing last-minute checks on equipment, loading ammunition, securing gear that would rattle loose during cross-country movement. The transition from the administrative march to combat operations was visible in how soldiers moved. During the march, there had been a kind of relaxed efficiency. But this morning, every action carried the tension of men preparing for violence. A tank commander from C Company approached Delnor and reported that one of his vehicles had developed a transmission problem overnight that maintenance crews were attempting to repair. "Will it be ready by 0600? Delnor asked. The tank commander hesitated. "Mechanics say maybe, but they're not confident. If we push it hard, the transmission might fail completely within a few hours." Delnor made a decision that reflected operational reality under Patton's command. Get it moving if at all possible. If it fails during the advance, we'll recover it then, but we cross the line of departure with every operational vehicle we have. The offensive began precisely on schedule at 0600 hours with Combat Command A under Colonel Carlton Russell, leading the advance south from Parsberg toward the Regen River, the first of multiple water obstacles the division would force during the coming week. Pete Stipanovich, driving his Sherman in the second wave of advancing armor, felt the familiar combination of fear and focus that characterized the transition from preparation to action. Fear because he understood that German forces might be waiting ahead with anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts. Focus because driving a 30-ton tank through unfamiliar terrain required constant attention to avoid obstacles, maintain formation, and respond to commands from the tank commander standing in the turret. Above, the countryside south of Parsberg was rolling agricultural land transitioning to forested hills as they approached Bavaria's more mountainous regions, terrain that offered both concealment and danger depending on whether you were attacking or defending. At 0734, Stipanovich's column encountered the first German resistance of the day, a hastily established roadblock manned by perhaps 30 soldiers who fired several bursts from machine guns before withdrawing when American tanks returned fire. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes and resulted in no American casualties, but it established that German forces were still present and still fighting despite the obvious inevitability of defeat. The crossing of the Regen River on April 26 proceeded with minimal opposition, German forces having withdrawn or surrendered rather than defending a water obstacle that couldn't be held without adequate forces and heavy weapons. But the ease of the Regen crossing didn't change the fact that the division was now committed to Patton's operational timeline, which demanded they continue advancing regardless of conditions or accumulated exhaustion. Captain O'Malley, whose task force crossed the Regen at 1,145 hours and immediately continued south without pause for rest or maintenance, understood that the pattern established during the 250-mile march, constant movement, abbreviated rest, acceptance of discomfort, would characterize the entire offensive. The march from Moheim to Nunkirchen had been preparation in more ways than one. It had conditioned soldiers to operate while exhausted, had taught them to sleep in snatches rather than expecting full nights of rest, had demonstrated that human beings could function at levels beyond what they thought possible when operation necessity demanded it. These were lessons that would be tested repeatedly over following days as the division advanced through Bavaria at speeds that exceeded logistical capabilities and pushed soldiers past sustainable limits. The evening of April 26 found the division positioned near Straubing after advancing over 50 kilometers in a single day of operations, having crossed the Regen River and encountered resistance that varied from non-existent to briefly intense. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, establishing his command post in a requisitioned German building, reviewed casualty reports that showed the day's fighting had cost 4 soldiers killed and 17 wounded. Not catastrophic numbers, but each representing an individual tragedy and a gap in unit capability that would be difficult to replace. The pattern that had begun during the march from Moheim continued during the offensive. Soldiers sleeping wherever they could find space, eating cold rations because hot meals required time nobody had, performing maintenance by flashlight because vehicles couldn't be allowed to fail simply because night had fallen. A maintenance sergeant, working on a tank that had thrown a track during the day's advance, later described the exhaustion that characterized this period. We'd been awake for over 20 hours, had been moving or fighting the entire time, and now we were repairing tracks in the dark because that tank needed to be operational by morning. Your body just learns to function on autopilot. Hands doing the work while your brain is somewhere else, maybe sleeping, maybe just shut down to conserve energy. You finish the job because if you don't, someone might die tomorrow when that tank isn't available. The crossing of the Danube River on April 27 through swollen waters and deep mud became one of the defining experiences of the offensive, testing whether soldiers who had already been pushed to their limits during the march and the first day of combat could execute complex operations requiring coordination, skill, and the kind of courage that comes not from enthusiasm, but from discipline and commitment to mission. The engineers in the 124th Armored Engineer Battalion who built pontoon bridges across the rain-swollen Danube worked in conditions that would have justified declaring the operation impossible. Fast current, limited visibility due to rain, and the knowledge that if they failed, infantry and armor waiting on the western bank would be trapped and vulnerable. Pete Stipanovich, waiting his turn to cross a completed bridge, watched engineers work waist-deep in cold water and thought about the different kinds of courage war required. Everybody thinks courage means charging into enemy fire with a rifle, and that is courage. But those engineers building bridges under these conditions, that took a different kind of courage. They weren't fighting Germans. They were fighting water and weather and physics. And if they screwed up, a lot of people would die. That's courage too. Maybe a harder kind because it doesn't look dramatic, but it's just as necessary. The advance from the Danube to the Isar River on April 27th to 28th compressed into 2 days what conventional planning was spread over a week, maintaining momentum that prevented German forces from establishing defensive lines, but also creating the kind of exhaustion that degraded judgment and increased the likelihood of mistakes that could prove fatal. Captain O'Malley, leading his task force toward the Isar River crossing near Plattling on April 28th, found himself making decisions based on incomplete information and impaired cognitive function that came from sustained sleep deprivation. At 0847 on April 28th, his lead tank encountered a fork in the road where the map showed only a single route, forcing him to make a choice about which direction to proceed with no way to verify which was correct. He chose left based on intuition rather than information and was correct, but the incident illustrated how operations at this tempo required commanders to make constant decisions with inadequate information and insufficient time for deliberate analysis. The 250-mile march from Moheim to Nunkirchen had prepared the division for sustained movement, but it hadn't prepared individual soldiers and commanders for the cumulative cognitive degradation that came from operating without adequate rest for over weeks straight. The crossing of the Isar River on April 28 completed a sequence of 3 major river crossings in 3 days: Regen, Danube, Isar. That would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but that felt almost routine to soldiers who had been forcing water obstacles for weeks and had learned that rivers were just another problem to solve through engineering, firepower, and determination. But the cost of maintaining this operational tempo was accumulating in ways that wouldn't be fully apparent until after the offensive ended. Soldiers were hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing things that weren't there, enemy soldiers who turned out to be shadows, obstacles in roads that didn't exist, movement in tree lines that was just wind. Crews were making mistakes that endangered themselves and others. A tank driver who fell asleep at the controls and nearly drove into a river before his assistant driver shook him awake. A gunner who fired at what he thought was a German position, but was actually a group of civilian refugees. Medical officers were documenting cases of acute stress reactions that manifested as tremors, inability to eat, emotional numbness, and dissociative episodes where soldiers seemed mentally absent even while physically present. The 250-mile march had conditioned soldiers to operate while tired, but it hadn't prepared them for this level of sustained exhaustion, and the human costs were mounting even as the operational objectives were being achieved. The liberation of Allied prisoners at Worth on April 28th and the subsequent advance into Austria on April 29th to 30th brought the offensive towards conclusion, with German resistance collapsing so rapidly that the question became not whether the division could accomplish its objectives, but whether soldiers could physically continue operating long enough to reach those objectives before complete exhaustion forced operational pauses. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, monitoring his battalion status on April 30th as they approached the Inn River and the Austrian border, recognized that the division was approaching its breaking point. Vehicle operational rates had dropped below 60% due to mechanical failures and abandonment of vehicles that couldn't be quickly repaired. Ammunition stocks were adequate, but requiring constant resupply. Fuel consumption was exceeding delivery rates. And most critically, soldiers were functioning at levels that medical personnel described as unsustainable. Men who couldn't remember their own names when asked, crews who had to be physically carried to their vehicles because they lacked strength to walk, officers making tactical decisions that showed impaired judgment consistent with severe sleep deprivation. The 250-mile march from Moheim to Nunkirchen had been preparation, but it had also been beginning of a process that pushed soldiers beyond what training manuals defined as sustainable operational limits. The entry into Braunau, Austria, on May 2, 1945, and the subsequent halt in offensive operations finally gave soldiers the rest they needed for over 2 weeks. But the transition from combat to garrison duties revealed how much the sustained operations had cost. Some soldiers collapsed and slept for 12 or 15 hours straight once permission to rest was granted. Others found they couldn't sleep despite exhaustion, their nervous systems too conditioned to hypervigilance to allow the shutdown that rest required. Medical officers documented cases of soldiers who showed symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as combat exhaustion, a condition distinct from physical fatigue that resulted from sustained exposure to stress without adequate recovery time. Captain O'Malley, observing his company during the first days after the halt, saw soldiers who looked physically present but mentally absent, going through motions of routine duties without the awareness and engagement that characterized healthy function. A conversation with his company first sergeant captured the concern. "Sir, the men are broken. Not permanently, probably, but they need weeks of rest. Not days. We push them past limits that shouldn't be pushed past, and some of them are going to carry effects from this for the rest of their lives." O'Malley knew the first sergeant was right, but also knew that the decision to push soldiers as hard hadn't been made at company or even division level. It was operational philosophy that came from Third Army and ultimately from Patton's belief that aggressive action saved lives by ending wars faster. The retrospective analysis of the 250-mile march from Moheim to Nunkirchen and the subsequent six-day offensive revealed a complex relationship between preparation and exploitation, between building capability and consuming it. The march had served as both rest period and conditioning. It had given soldiers respite from the intense combat of the Ruhr pocket operations, while simultaneously preparing them psychologically and physically for the sustained operations that would follow. Sleeping in German beds had provided better rest than soldiers had experienced in weeks, even as the moral ambiguity of occupying enemy civilian spaces created psychological complexity. Foraging for eggs had improved nutrition and morale, while also raising questions about the line between legitimate military requisition and theft. The constant movement had conditioned soldiers to function, while tired, while also depleting reserves that couldn't be fully restored in the brief period between operations. In essence, the march had been both recovery and expenditure, simultaneously building up capability and using it in ways that would make subsequent operations possible but costly. Pete Stipanovich, reflecting on the experience decades later, summarized it. The march gave us just enough rest to think we could handle what came next, but not enough to actually be ready for it. We were slightly less exhausted when we started the Bavaria offensive than we'd been at the end of the Ruhr fighting, and that slight difference was enough to let us complete the mission. But it was like running a race when you're already tired. You can do it, but you pay for it afterward in ways that people who weren't there can't really understand. What happens to soldiers when they're given brief respite between sustained combat operations, but that respite isn't long enough for genuine recovery? How does the experience of sleeping in enemy civilian beds, while those civilians are displaced, affect soldiers' sense of moral clarity about the war they're fighting? When examining the 250-mile march from Mulheim to Nunkirchen in April 1945, what stands out is not the march itself, which was administratively successful and accomplished its objective of repositioning the division, but rather what the march reveals about the relationship between human limitations and military necessity. The division moved 250 miles in 4 days, rested briefly, then immediately began a 6-day offensive that crossed multiple rivers and advanced over 200 additional kilometers through enemy territory. This was operationally brilliant, strategically effective, and humanly devastating in ways that wouldn't fully manifest until soldiers tried to return to normal life after the war. The 250-mile march prepared soldiers for what followed, but preparation doesn't mean protection. It just means they were conditioned to endure more than they would have otherwise been able to endure, which allowed them to accomplish missions, but at costs that accumulated in minds and bodies rather than in casualty reports. Does military effectiveness justify pushing soldiers past sustainable limits when the strategic objective is ending war faster? Can the lives saved by rapid advance be fairly weighed against the psychological and physical damage inflicted on soldiers who executed those advances? And when those soldiers return home carrying memories of sleeping in German beds while German families were displaced, of foraging for eggs in abandoned farms, of pushing themselves past exhaustion until their bodies and minds broke in ways that never fully healed, what do they make of the experience? And how did societies that celebrated military victory process the human cost that victory demanded? These questions matter because they force us to look beyond operational success and tactical brilliance, to confront the reality that wars are fought by human beings with human limitations, and that exceeding those limitations may achieve objectives but creates consequences that persist long after the fighting stops and the parades end and the veterans try to resume lives that can never quite match the intensity of what they experienced during those weeks when every day brought movement and exhaustion and the constant possibility of death.